You see, there's something special about the mountain. Last week I watched a movie called Finding the Real Mount Sinai. And in Arabic, they call the mountain Jebel. But I want us to take a look at Exodus 19, verses 10 to 20. And as we do that, before we do that, let me give you a little bit of background about what's going on here. The Israelites have left Egypt. They have crossed through the Red Sea. And they've been walking around for about 3 months. And Moses leads them out into the desert. And let's read. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate today and tomorrow." Now this is important because this is the mountain where God is at this particular point with them walking through the wilderness. And He's wanting them to consecrate themselves because God is holy. So He's wanting them and telling them to consecrate themselves. And it's so important that He says, have them wash their clothes and be ready by the 3rd day. Because on that day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. They are to be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on them. No person or animal shall be permitted to live. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they approach the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, prepare yourself for the 3rd day. Abstain from sexual relations. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of the Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. The mountain where God was reigning, called Mount Sinai by some, Mount Horeb by others. But the thing that's important is that Moses had been up the mountain. He had been in the presence of God. He had seen the burning bush that was on fire but not burning. He had removed his sandals from his feet because he was on holy ground. And all of a sudden God says, prepare these people, consecrate them, have them be sanctified, wash their clothes, abstain from sexual relations, get their act together, clean it up, be ready to encounter the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, it's very interesting that God shows up in the form of a cloud, lightning, burning through all this, because in those days, that's exactly how the non-believers thought Baal showed up. That he was in the storm, that he was in the thunder and the lightning and the cloud. But God comes that same way to show that he is the one and only God. You see, those false beliefs about Baal was trying to lead people away. But God said, don't let anybody touch the mountain because it's that holy. God is that holy and that precious that no one, no thing, no animal could touch the mountain. Oh, the mountain. There's something special about the mountain. Let's look at Genesis 8:4. The background with this is the flood has taken place. Noah's on the ark. He's got all the animals. He's got his family. It's been raining. There's a major flood, and he's floating around. And then all of a sudden, it said on the 17th day of the rest on the mountains of Ararat. It's the mountain. God is choosing to start over again on the mountain. And he has the ark land on a mountain. Let's look at 1 Kings 18:17-21. Let me give you a little background here. We have the prophet Elijah who called for the rain to stop and for famine to come on the country. And for 3 years it did not rain, and severe famine took place. And the king of the time was Ahab, who was married to Jezebel. And she was a persecutor of God's prophets. And Ahab seemed to let her run wild. So God was not pleased with that. So Elijah calls this famine, for it not to rain. And he is going to approach King Ahab and discuss this with him. And it says, when he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Now, Asherah is the female goddess, a sexual, sensual goddess, a prostitute. And Baal, we mentioned earlier about being supposedly in the cloud, in the thunder, in the lightning. And he said, bring all those prophets, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asher. That's 850 prophets who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel mountain. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions, between two gods? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Elijah is saying, if God is God, follow him. If Baal's God, follow him. So he puts out this challenge where they build an altar, they put a sacrifice on it, and he tells the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah to burn up the sacrifice. And then he mocks them and makes fun of them, says, maybe you need to shout louder. Maybe you need to dance around more. And this went on for quite some time and nothing happened. There was no lightning, there was no thunder, there was no cloud. And then Elijah came and he made a trench and he poured water all over that altar, doused it in water, and then prayed to God. And God sent the thunder, the lightning, the cloud, and burned up and consumed all the sacrifice. And burned up all the prophets. The 850 had died on the mountain. There's something special about the mountain. The mountain calls us. Today the mountain is calling your name. Nancy, come to the mountain. Tom, come to the mountain. Yael, come to the mountain. The mountain is where we find God and we find revelation. The mountain is where we encounter God, a holy God. There's a quote from a John Muir. You are not in the mountains are in you. You are not in the mountains are in you. And we have a view here on top of the mountain looking down into the valley. But I want to change that quote. I want to say that you are not in God, but God is in you. You are not in God, but God is in you. What does a mountain represent to you? What does it represent? We have a valley here, a beautiful valley on top looking down. What does a mountain represent to you? Strength? Courage? Fear? Doubt? Unworthiness? What does the mountain represent to you? Everyone wants to reach the peak. Everyone wants to be on top of the mountain. Everyone wants to have that God experience on the mountain. But few put in the effort to climb. We all want to see how marvelous the works are. We all long to stand there and be in awe of the mountain and the view. But few of us put forth the effort to climb. Well, you're saying, if this mountain is so great, why do we live in the valley? In the Arabic, valley is called El Uwedi, meaning the valley, the down low. What does the valley represent to you? Does a valley represent a source of security, comfort, hardship, problems, difficulties? Does it represent enemies, sin, destruction, or opportunities? Let's look at Psalm 23, verse 4. Famous psalm, we all know this. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Some of you may know it as, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Being in the midst of the valley, a valley that's dark, a valley that death is all around. But even though we're in the midst of that valley, he says, fear no evil, because God is with us. The God of the mountain is with us. Fear no evil, for he's with us. For his rod and his staff, they comfort us. What does a rod and a staff do? Protects, guides, directs, keeps away the wolves, and keeps the flock together. Let's look at the next point that I have. It says, enjoy God on the mountaintop. Trust God in the valleys. Enjoy God on the mountaintop, but trust him in the valley. What that's saying is when you encounter God on that mountain, it's like a spiritual high, a connectedness to an almighty, all-powerful God. But as in Psalm 23 says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it says to trust him in the valley. Remember what it was like when you were on the mountain so that now you're in the valley. Trust Him. Trust Him. The next bullet point I have is the God on the mountain is still the same God in the valleys. That same God that you encountered on the mountain is the exact same God that's in the valley of the shadow of death, where there looks like there's no hope, where there's destruction, where there's sin, where there's fear, where there's hopelessness. That same God that you experienced here is the same God that's here with you in the valley. Let's look at Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. I lift my eyes to the mountains. There we go again, mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. While you are down in the valley, it says to look to the mountain. Because it's not the mountain you're looking at, it's who is on the mountain. God. God is on the mountain. I lift my eyes unto the mountains. Where does my help come from? The maker of the heaven, the maker of the mountain, the maker of the valley. That is where our help comes from. We must remember when we're in the valley. Remember what it was like to be on the mountain. But remember what it took to get to the mountain. Remember what it took to get to the mountain. We all like to be on the mountain. But we can't stay on the mountain. Have you heard of this great mountaintop experience? It's a great high. It's a wonderful thing that you don't want to leave. You want to encounter and stay with it all the time because it's so wonderful. It's a mountaintop experience. It's a, wow, this is great. Wow, this feels good. Wow, it smells good. Wow, it sounds good. Wow, I just feel the electricity up here. I feel the beauty. I feel and see God's nature. I want to stay on the mountaintop experience. Let's take a look at Matthew 17. Verses 1 through 8. This is called the Mount of Transfiguration. The mountain. Again, we're talking about the mountains. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him 3 people, Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. Meaning Jesus was transfigured before the 3. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah walking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud, there's that cloud again that we talked about, that God comes in the cloud, the thunder, the lightning, and covered them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Now, this also is said when Jesus is baptized. A voice comes from the heavens that said, this is my son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground because they were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. You see, Jesus takes 3 of his closest friends up the mountain to have an encounter. They don't know they're going to have an encounter with God. They don't know what's going to happen, but all of a sudden they see Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And they say, let's stay up here. Let's build some shelters. Let's build another tent. Like in Moses' day, they had the tent of meetings where they would meet. God would meet them, speak to them. They wanted to build an altar, so to speak, for those three holy men of God, because they had encountered something great. And they hear a voice come out of this cloud. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. They're so afraid they can't even look. They're bowed down and they're terrified and they're shaking because this voice comes out of nowhere, comes out of the cloud. And they're like, wow. Jesus says, don't be afraid, get on up, and there's nobody there. And this is such a great mountaintop experience, they don't want to leave. Would you want to leave if you were in the presence of God? We go to the mountain to experience God and to learn. In Luke 6:12, Jesus wanted to experience God the Father. One of those days, Jesus went out to a where? A mountainside to pray and spend the night praying to God. He was looking to encounter God. So he goes to the mountainside and prays to learn, to commune with God. In Matthew 5, verses 1 to 10, this is probably the greatest sermon ever preached, called the Sermon on the Mount. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. Now in Jewish custom, when the rabbi sat down, that's when he began to teach. It wasn't from a standing position like I am. They would sit and they would talk, and that was when they were teaching, and his disciples came to him. So when he sat down, they knew he was going to be teaching. And he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be fulfilled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemaker, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God." It's called the Beatitudes. This is the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. Jesus was teaching ways for them to live life and to live it to the full, to have it abundant. Jesus also taught in Matthew 28, after he had died and had been resurrected. He's teaching in Matthew 28, 16 to 20. He said, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee to where? A mountain." There's got to be something special about a mountain, because it's talked about so much in Scripture, where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always." His name's not surely, it's just a reference. It says, "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." He's teaching them again. It's called the Great Commission. He gives it to them on a mountain. It's a great claim because Jesus says all authority, not some authority, but all authority has been given to Jesus. And he's going to give it to the disciples. The Great Commission says to go into all the world, to preach and to teach, to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the great comfort, I am with you always. The great claim, all authority. The Great Commission, to go. The great comfort, I am with you always. On all three of those, they were on the mountain. And God taught them. Jesus taught them. The goal of the gospel of grace is this. It's to obey. Sir, yes, sir. Just like a drill sergeant. In the army, you learn to obey his commands. We are under his command. Our next bullet point says, on the mountain, we learn to embrace and obey so that we can live out reality in the valley. On the mountain is where we learn to embrace and obey. And we learn it on the mountain so that we can live out that reality in the valley, because we can't stay on the mountain. Another something amazing happened on a mount. It's called the Mount of Olives. You see, after Jesus had celebrated the Passover meal with his disciples, he went to the Mount of Olives. And he said, hey, Dad, I don't want to do this. No, Dad, I don't think you understand me. I really, really don't want to do this. But then again, he said, not my will, but yours. You see, Jesus did not want to go to the cross. He did not want to suffer that kind of death and humiliation. He did not want to do that. But he said, not my will, but yours. He was in such agony that he sweated drops of blood. On that mountain, the Mount of Olives, we find surrender. I want to talk to you about one last mount. Mount Calvary. Mount Calvary, called Golgotha or the skull, because as you look, you can kind of see some eyes and a little nose down here. It looks a little like some teeth. Mount Calvary. Psalm 121, we already went through, said, I lift my eyes to the mount. That is where my help comes from. I lift my eyes to the mount where Jesus was crucified. That is where my help comes from. On the mount, we find sacrifice. On the mount, we find sacrifice. What the enemy saw as a victory in the death of the Messiah, God had the victory. On the mount. On the mount. And the people down here watching all this looked up to the hills. What was considered by some to be the greatest tragedy in history, to be the worst kind of death, dying on a cross, being humiliated, hanging there. On the mountain, we find sacrifice. What does the mountain mean to you? If you're facing a mountain in your life, I want to tell you, you have choices. If you are facing a mountain in your life, you have choices. You can choose to ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist. You can choose to turn around and go back to where you came from and say, it's okay there. It really wasn't that bad. I don't know why I left to come to the mountain in the first place. You can turn around and go back to the same old, same old. You can try to go around it. You can try to undermine it by digging under it or flying over it. Or you can choose to acknowledge the existence of the mountain. And you can choose to climb it. And when you climb it, you can enjoy the view. You see, those same options that I talked about, those same choices I talked about with the mountain, is the same way we treat God of the mountain. We try to ignore God and pretend He doesn't exist. We get to God and we get right face to face with Him and we say, no, this is too hard. We turn around and we go back to the same old, to where we came from. Or we reach God and we say, no, there's got to be another way. So we try to go around the mountain. And there are even people who try to undermine God by saying He doesn't exist. Yet they're staring at the mountain. They try to undermine and say there is no God. They say, if God is such a loving God, why are so many people hurting? So they try to undermine God. They try to dig their way under Him. They try to fly over Him. But there's people like you and I who have come to today and said, I see the mountain. I see the mountain. It exists. And I want to climb that mountain because I know from what I've heard today what happens on the mountain. I know that I can experience God in a new way. I know that I can learn from God on the mountain to know how to live in the valley. I know that if I go to the mountain, that I have to surrender. And that I have to be willing to sacrifice myself for the good of humanity. I have to deny myself and follow Jesus up a mountain that I may not want to go. But Peter, James, and John went up the mountain and they encountered Elijah and Moses, the two greatest prophets. And then they heard the voice of God. What is the voice of God saying to you today? I tell you, you can make that climb. I tell you, you can make that journey. I tell you that as you learn and enjoy the mountain, God will teach you how to live in the valley. And if there's one thing I know came from one of the strangest places that I would never even suspect, hearing the voice of God. But I heard the voice of God say, ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough to keep me away from you. Ain't no mountain high enough. God sang that to me through the Supremes. Because He loves me that much. He says there's no mountain high enough. There's no valley low enough. There's no river wide enough. Nothing can separate you from God. not the mountain, not the river, not the valley, nothing. He says to you, I love you. Come to the mountain. Come to the mountain. Come to the mountain. Because that's where you will encounter me in a way that will expose and show you the truth and the light. Come to the mountain so that you know how to live in the valley. Today, there's some of you who are saying that mountain's too high. I'm living in a valley and it's really low and I don't like being here. But I don't have the fortitude or the strength to climb that mountain. Today is the day. Sanctify yourself. Wash your clothes. Get ready because God is going to come down the mountain to you. I'm not saying you can earn your salvation I'm not saying clean yourself up. I'm saying get ready to encounter a holy God. Get ready. Prepare yourself with expectation that as you go to the foot of the mountain, you don't have to climb the mountain. God will come down to you. That is the God we serve. That is the holy God. That's the God that comes in the cloud. That's the God that comes in the lightning and the thunder. That's the voice that says, Jesus is my Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no man will go to the Father except through the Son. No man means no man. As hard as you try, Elijah has come. And Jesus is our sacrifice.